Excited about this morning's message. I know that's no surprise to you. If you're here often or watching, I'm always excited about the message. Hey, one last thing real quick before I jump into this. Shout out Leah for last week's word. Woo, that was good, right? Whoa, man. Hole in the roof gang. That was so powerful. I'm going to pray again. Lord, thank you for this morning's message. I got the Trinity on prayers this morning, Jesus, but I need to pray. God, help us as we settle into your word. And in this week in the Sunday School series, God, to hear your heart. God, to embrace what you speak to us and apply it to how we live. Come on, in Jesus' name, everybody said amen and amen. So today's Sunday School story, are you ready? Is the story of a couple of guys named Joshua and Caleb. And a time when they believed God for a promised land that almost no one else thought was possible. I mean, they were significantly in the minority in what they were believing God for in going into the promised land. And the names Joshua and Caleb, even if you weren't familiar with the story, would be familiar to you because, they're two of the most common names for the last at least 50 years, and I'm sure before that. But research, they started doing this whole thing about baby names and what names mean and how common they are, especially in English. And these are two of the most common boy names for a minute. In fact, true story, for the last 50 years, the name Caleb has consistently landed in the top 50. I mean, that's a lot of names. There's a lot of names. So top 50, that's a big deal. We had Caleb on the stage today. He's right back there, and he was thumping that bass. Come on, Caleb. Give it up for Caleb. And then, not really. You can. If you want to clap for Caleb, it's cool. And then there was a Joshua. I already said that on the stage too, over here playing the guitar. Joshua. For the last 50 years, the name Joshua has consistently landed in the top 10. And topped out at number 1 a couple of times, and I'm pretty sure Caleb just booed. We got a name competition going. Hey, man, you can have a whole lot of kids and name them all Caleb. You can help your own statistics. It's fun. And our story, the story we're considering, starts today with about 2.5 million-ish people at a place called Kadesh Barnea, which was very near the banks of the Jordan River. And it's essentially staged just outside the boundary of Canaan, which was considered by the people of God, Chris, the children of Israel, the promised land. They were right there, right on the banks of the promised land. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 1 tells us this: the Lord now said to Moses, their leader, send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the promised land, that I'm giving to the Israelites. Send one leader from each of the 12 ancestral tribes. So Moses did as the Lord commanded. He sent out 12 men, all tribal leaders of Israel, from their camp in the wilderness of Paran. Now, this wasn't the first time they'd been there, by the way, Daniel. Now, this 2.5-ish million, that was probably the first time they'd been there. Pretty confident that I can say that. But it wasn't the first time that the children of Israel or the people of God had been here, or certainly not even just here, but the promised land that's across the Jordan from them. They had been there before. Abraham was God's sort of original good listener from a period of several hundred years before, and God called him out of a place called the Ur of Chaldees, and he said, you're going to go somewhere, you don't know where, but I'm going to get you there, right, Miss Nancy? I'll take care of it. You just follow me, and I'll get you where you need to go. And he made Abraham promises that were crazy. God ever make you crazy promises? Of course he did. I mean, if you have this book, there's stuff in this book that's unbelievable. What God speaks to you about who you can be and how your life can live. Sometimes in this world that we live in, this seems patently impossible. Right. Yeah, well, this Bible, whoever wrote it, right? They didn't know about my brokenness, didn't know my hurt or history. They don't know my family story. Come on. All that stuff was lost some time ago, right? And God spoke to Abraham, Sarah, and said, you are going to have so many kids that you're essentially going to be a mighty nation, a huge, your descendants will be more than the sands of the sea. And Abraham's wife was barren, and you're going to inhabit this land. But he saw the fulfillment. He didn't see it all, but he saw the fulfillment of a lot of that promise, and he himself and his family lived in Canaan. They'd been here before. That's what I'm trying to say. And in fact, his son Isaac was born there, and his grandson Jacob was born there. Now Jacob, God changed Jacob's name to Israel, hence the children of Israel in our story. We'll be talking about that because they were descendants of Jacob. And Jacob, during a time of famine, moved his family to Egypt. There was a miraculous provision in that because of his son Joseph. And I mean, talk about an 828 story that I don't have time to tell. But Jacob moved his family of about 70, according to Genesis 46, to Egypt during a time of famine. And honestly, when they first got to Egypt, Joseph had such favor with the Pharaoh that it wasn't bad. It was a pretty good gig. Wasn't a bad place to be, Tony. They did well. But after about 70 years, as leaderships transitioned, they started to live in a life that was a life of bondage and slavery under the heavy hand of one Pharaoh after another. And now in our story today, some 430 years later, according to prophecy and promise, God has raised up a deliverer in the man Moses. This is where we are in the story today. I just brought us up to speed. God raised up a deliverer in the man Moses. 430 years they've been living in Egypt, not in their promised land. They've been living under burden and brokenness. Come on, somebody. And in captivity. They didn't get to decide who they were, how they lived. At least they didn't think they did, and certainly on some physical level they didn't. Though there were those that still held on to faith. Come on. 430 years later, God raised up a deliverer in the man Moses. And after significant divine intervention, again, man, talk about giving a synoptic version of a story. After significant divine intervention, somebody say plagues, because they had some. Whew, Lord. The Pharaoh said, okay. You know what I'm saying? Like Moses wrote, let my people go. Let my people go. Pharaoh got tired of the song and dance and said, just get out of here, man. Take them. Take them. And so Moses started on a journey with 2.5-ish million. What the Bible actually tells us in Numbers 26 is that there was 602,000 family men. And from there we extrapolate the average size of a family and come up with our 2.5-ish, incidentally. I think that's fascinating. 602,000 family men. That's a lot of kids. Help us, Lord. All right. And Moses is leading that crew. And they're coming out. Exodus 14 tells us, Miss Mary, that God led them to this place on the banks of the Red Sea, between a couple of mountains, literally. This place, but he told Moses, he said, I'm doing this on purpose, don't panic. I'm doing this on purpose. I'm going to take you here. Pharaoh's going to see you, think you're trapped, and he's going to come after you. Come on, some of us at this point in the story, we're like, okay, hey, God, sorry, so sorry. Could we redirect right there? Because I really don't want to go there. I don't want to follow you to that place where obviously I'm going to be boxed, right? I'm going to be boxed in. This is a bad idea, God. Let's don't do that. Let me give you a little heads up. Our first takeaway for this morning. God is a military mastermind who knows how to defeat your enemy. So I'm going to make a strong suggestion this morning. Try trusting him. I'm going to say it again. God is a military mastermind who knows how to defeat. He knows how to defeat your enemy. And as is often the case, even with us and our enemy, the devil, or in this case Pharaoh, overplayed his hand. He came after him hard. He pushed him real hard. Come on, the enemy does that to us too. How many of you in your life, you know, if he had just left you a little bit broken, you might have never come for your deliverance.
Okay, all right.
But I mean, you got real broken. And in that place of brokenness, you ran to Jesus. Not everyone does. Some people run from. I'm the one that's always standing on this stage advocating run to, not from. Run to, not from. Run to, not from God. Run to God, not from God. Right. And often the enemy overplays his hand. He comes so hard and heavy. They're trapped. I got them boxed in. I'm going to kill them. He was coming. The Pharaoh was coming. Now what God knew was Pharaoh was always coming. It wouldn't have mattered had they gone around the Red Sea and worked their way into the wilderness. Pharaoh was coming. I don't know how to break this to you except just to break it to you. Your brokenness is always coming. But there is a deliverance that you have in Jesus that is real and eternal. You understand what I'm saying? And it requires obedience. You don't get to tap out on following God and then somehow still stay free. It doesn't work that way. If Moses hadn't listened to God, Pharaoh would have caught them. And it looked crazy. I have another takeaway. A dead end is a great place to see God work for our benefit, healing, and freedom. Moses brought Pharaoh there on purpose because he knew exactly what was going to happen. So he had Moses raise his rod, the Red Sea parts. This isn't even our story yet. The Red Sea parts, and 2.5 million people walk across on dry land. They didn't even have to get their shoes muddy, which I do appreciate. And then Pharaoh chased them with his army, the one that could have pursued them. And then as soon as the last Israelite stepped out on the dry land, God closed the sea on Pharaoh's army. Listen, if you'll follow him, if you'll be obedient in the instruction he gives to you, God will make you free. I have another takeaway for us. Believing in God when what he says seems counterintuitive is often the key to our own deliverance. And I'm going to say again what he says, not something we decide to say. We say something to our hearts that's counterintuitive. Match it with the word. But there are some things in this word, that doesn't make any sense. I can't do that. I can't follow God in that way. But they did, and God made them real free. Somebody say real free. Whew, real free. And then, so they've stepped out of the Red Sea, and they're in this area between the Red Sea and the Jordan River that we will disaffectionately call today the wilderness. Somebody say wilderness. I'm gonna need a little help with the preach this morning. Wilderness. Anybody ever been there? Yeah. I mean, you broke free, but you still weren't where you were going. Yeah. Well, you just keep walking. Okay, I'm going to talk about that some right now. This is where we're going right now. So they stepped out, now they're in the wilderness. It was 263-ish, as the crow fly miles from the Red Sea to the banks of the Jordan, to this place we've already heard about, Kadesh Barnea, near the banks of the Jordan River, overlooking the Promised Land. About 263-ish miles. They probably couldn't walk a straight path, but even if they had just diligently walked, it might have taken a couple of hard walking 3 or 4 weeks to get there because it was a lot of people. Some were older, some were small. So I'm sure, if me and you was trekking and we was just trying to get there, we could do it in about 12 days. But that's, that was way too many bathroom breaks in this crew for that to work that way. Best case scenario, a couple of weeks, it took 2 years. 2 years. But they weren't actually off schedule. Still preaching up here. A couple of weeks ago, we had Christmas in July, and God said to us, don't push. This was God's process. Some of us this morning were in process. Just follow him. He's doing work. He's setting you up for victory. Stay patient. Don't bail, right? There were a lot of folk in the land that they were traveling through that were not people of God, that were making choices that were different than the choices that they were called to make. And if they had, and some did, shifted to those cultures, they would not have found their way. Come on to the Promised Land. Are you hearing me this morning? That's pretty good. They were learning how to be free. In this 2 years, they were learning how to be free. They spent a lot of time at Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. Horeb was probably a chain of mountains, and Sinai was a specific mountain. Moses came down from the mount with the 10 commandments. There was a lot of purging that had to happen in this time period. There was a lot of pruning in people that was happening. They were getting ready. Come on, somebody say, getting ready to go into their promised land. They weren't ready. When they walked out of Egypt, they didn't know how to be free. They didn't understand who they were called to be. They had lost their way as a culture, and God was rebuilding that in them. They were learning how to be free, how to be people of promise, how to be people who followed God. Find God's pace and walk it. That's the word of the Lord in that. Moses knew the power too of the power of process and understood transformation happens in the wilderness. Transformation happens in the wilderness when we trust God. And after that time at Mount Horeb, and not only that, but they were led and fed. I mean, God led them. They had a fire by night, a cloud by day. They were fed. They got a little bit of spiritual or physical, in this case, welfare, and they were handed some manna and some quail. And I'm sure they liked it, and they were camped. And at one point in Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses is sort of giving a long historical recount, and I'll reference Deuteronomy several times this morning, but he was giving a historical recount, and he said that God spoke this to us, and he said, you've been at this mountain long enough. So the 2 years was his process, but then he said, you've been here long enough. Go into the land and possess it. It's time. It's time for you to possess the promises that I've made to you. And then in verse 20 of Deuteronomy 1, he said this to the people of God. He said, and then I said to you, you have reached the hill country. So now he's telling the story that we're reading in Numbers. But this historical perspective that he gives is a little more synoptic, hence the reason I chose it here. You have now reached the hill country of the Amorites that the Lord our God is giving us. Look, he has placed the land in front of you. Go and occupy it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Easy for you to say. I mean, I'm sure he felt that way, actually. But you all came to me and said, so he said, don't be afraid and don't be discouraged. But then you came to me and said, first, let's send out scouts to explore the land for us. They will advise us on, listen to how what they sold this to Moses as. They will advise us on the best route to take and which town we should enter. This seemed like a good idea to me, so I chose 12 scouts, one from each of your tribes. And they headed for the hill country and came to the valley of Eshcol. They walked about 500 miles to explore this land of Canaan. These guys were, Joshua and Caleb, for instance, were in their 30s, maybe pushing 40 in the case of Caleb, and probably early 30s in the case of Joshua. I say young men. I mean, yeah, relatively young. They weren't babies, but they were grown men, and they went and they walked it out. He said, this seemed like a good idea to me. Sent them. They picked some of the fruit and brought it back to us, and they reported, the land the Lord our God has given us is indeed a good land. And I just want to point out right here that these guys that were sent out from our verses that we've already read from Numbers 13, 1 through 3, they were called to be scouts. Somebody say scouts. Man, I'm just asking for talkback today. I don't know what's going on with me. Scouts. They were called to be scouts. They were supposed to scout it out. They weren't sent to decide if, but to assess how. That's what they were called to do, not to decide if we should go. Stop deciding for God if, and hear from God how. They were not called to go and decide if. What instruction were they listening to? It wasn't from Moses. It wasn't from God. God cleared the plan to send the scouts. Numbers tells us that. God said, yeah, send them. It's cool. Go for it. God doesn't mind if we vision, if we strategize, if we plan. You should have heard us at Advance of 828 South. So it started with a crazy big idea. And then God started kind of sorting things. And I'm meeting with, the lead team. I'm talking to Leah. She says if I say it for the third time, it means that I'm actually going to start doing something. Like I just keep kind of verbally processing. And he said, we're going to launch a location in Southport 3 times. So we better start getting ready. Right? But there is a point there in this version of our story where we're trying to discern, is that what God wills for us to do? But when God said yes, then the hurdles are just meant to be cleared. Yeah. Did you love the Olympics? I didn't even know what was happening, to be frank. I mean, it was the 2020 Olympics. I was very confused. But Josh and Megan were over and they were watching. I was like, oh, the Olympics. I remember liking that. And then I do like track and field, and I'm so impressed with the hurdlers. Anybody? Because they run like the 110 hurdles. I was on my front porch having coffee with Jesus one day last week, and I was just chatting it up, and I felt like the Lord said, you're called to be a hurdler because you still get to run fast, but you just got to clear hurdles while you do. And they fascinate me. They do better than that. I'm just acting like I got drop foot or something. But they do better. They run so fast over the hurdles. 110 is only a couple of seconds slower than the 100-meter sprint. It's crazy. And the ones that are good at it, their heads don't even move. Like, how are you doing that? And that day, in our efforts in South and in our family, there were 6 hurdles that just went foo, 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 foo. And we just kept sprinting, man. Just keep running. Woo, woo. You can even knock a hurdle down if you need to. Just keep running. Just, any hurdlers in the house? I got mad respect for you. Yeah, wow, I'm impressed. God's called us to that. And they were not called to go decide if. They were meant to vision it. That's what we're doing right now. God, who needs to know you and where? Help us understand. We're kind of landlocked. This is a cool building. I like it. I do. This building is two things. It's too small, but it's also an awesome studio. So we feel like it's still a good primary location, and we're thankful, and we're always looking for more space, and we'll keep pursuing God in that way. But the reality is, all we really care about is following God and reaching people. Amen. That's what we're trying to do, just in case you're curious. But there are always going to be obstacles. And it would be easier, come on somebody, it would be easier to say it's a pandemic. It's a pandemic. You can. Good job. It would be easier to say, we can't do stuff right now. And regardless of what you think or where you land on what's going on in this world, one thing I do know we could all agree on if we're God followers is we should still be following God. I mean, put your foot on the floor and go for it, and let's see what good we can do. And that's how we started 2021. Let's just go for it. I don't know how it's going to work. I can't promise you it'll all work out. But God said go, and that's what we need to know. And now let's vision it. Yep. Let's assess and see, and let's follow. Let's do the best we can, and then watch God work. Amen. He might just drown the army of our enemy in full view. Because He's God, and He does stuff like that. But this was their report to Moses, Numbers 13:27. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed beautiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. And here's the kind of fruit it produces. They brought some of it back, huge grapes and such. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. And when we saw giants there. Well, that sounds so familiar. How many cups of coffee have I had with someone with that's essentially, I saw giants there. I hear what you're saying about what God wills for me, but I saw giants. I can never overcome that addiction. I can never overcome that desire. That's the way my mama was. That's the way I'm always going to be. I saw giants there. Broken might be your history. It doesn't have to be your future.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, I didn't put it up. Thanks, Tex. Tex said that's a good takeaway. He's right. Next week I'll let him write the takeaways. That's a good one. That was the Holy Spirit. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and all along the Jordan Valley. All those ites, they're there. And then Caleb stepped up. Gotta love Caleb. Caleb said, what are we doing right now? Where did this pity party come from? We all just walked through that land together. What are y'all doing? Shouting out the enemy instead of the promise. And so Caleb said in verse 30, but Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. And he said this, let's go at once to take the land. We can certainly conquer it. Again, just a challenge the Lord spoke to my heart. Stop trying to talk yourself out of God's will.
Yeah. That's it.
Just stop. That's what they were doing. They saw it. There was probably at one point, they were so excited, Don, about the promised land. And then somewhere along the way, they started to grumble. They were there for 40 days and 40 nights, and they started to grumble. And they started to speak negativity to the hope that he had given. And before you knew it, they believed that the obstacles were greater, right, than the God of the promise. A takeaway here: the sooner you give glory to, or the sooner you give God glory, the quicker you'll find God's grace. That's it. Caleb's just like, okay, I'm not shouting that out. I'm not going to shout out about the giants. I'm going to talk about God. Yeah. Have you seen how big God is? Do you remember his faithfulness to us? Do you remember in Egypt how he delivered us from the Pharaoh? Do you remember the Red Sea? Were you there for that? The 2 years that they wandered in the wilderness, I mean, they saw incredible, miraculous provision. Do you remember the manna and the quail and the way he led us and cared for us? We were led and fed and protected, and now you're worried about giants. This is Caleb. What you shouting out? What are you shouting out? What are you posting? What are you reading? What are you believing? What are you saying? The spirit of life and death is in the thumb. Come on. Numbers 13:31. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go against them. They're stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw the giants there. They're just being redundant at this point. The descendants of Anak. And then this, next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought, too. I like the older translation that says we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And that's what they thought, too. I'm going to just wrap this with this point and then try to finish this message strong here. But we're not called to decide if God's will is walkable, but to faithfully discern the next step in walking it.
That's right.
That was almost today's big takeaway, but I got one more for you that took its place. But we're not called to decide if God's will is walkable, but to faithfully discern the next step in walking it. But here's the commentary. Moses shared again in his recount in Deuteronomy 21 or 126. Excuse me, but you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God and refused to go in. Let that never be said of us. But you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God and refused to go in. How many times is this us? How many times has God set deliverance and freedom in front of us, but there are certain actions and activities, maybe they're okay for that guy, but not for me, because they always seem to be my undoing. God speaks to our heart, and God wills things for us, and he's calling us to certain things. I was speaking to someone this week, and I said, there are things that God will say for you to do, and there are things that God will say for you to stop doing. He will always do that in the way that he directs us. And often what we give God is what they gave God, a hard no. Yes. This wasn't even, I'll think about it. This was a hard no. This was nope. Not gonna, can't do it, not gonna try. I think that's where they landed up. In Deuteronomy 132, Moses said to them, even after all God did, you refused to trust the Lord, your God. And then, from there, Numbers 14, verse 1 tells us the whole community began weeping aloud. They cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died. This is where, for me, the story gets the most ridiculous, Chris. This part right here. This is like the most ridiculous part of this story happens right here. If only we had died in Egypt. Or even in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Yeah, that's what he's doing. Listen, it's okay to bring your questions to God. He is big enough for that, and he is not bothered by it. Do not make accusations against his character. He doesn't deserve that, and it will only separate you from him. Like God's bringing them out of Egypt. Ha! I punked you. I called you my people. I made a promise to Abraham and to Jacob so I could finally get you here and kill you. Made all those prophecies come true. Listen, I feel like I'm over the top this morning, but man, our wives, they went on to say, and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Then they plotted amongst themselves, let us choose a new leader to go back to Egypt. Everybody looking for a leader that'll take them back to Egypt. And maybe, again, this is the most ridiculous part of the story. Like, go back to Egypt. Like somehow the Pharaoh is going to be nice this time. Like the last time you saw him, it was like, hey, buddy, we'll see you. Sorry about your army. Right? We're good, though, hey? Listen. God's given you an opportunity to be free. Take it. Take it. And don't turn back to your bondage. Don't, I understand. I understand it's intimidating to follow God. I understand. But it's the path to freedom. Amen. And hope and provision. He's faithful. He's proven it. Somebody help me. Over and over and over, he's proven it. Running back to your bondage is always a bad idea. Don't go back. Don't try to stay where you are. Trust God and move forward. And then Numbers 14:6 tells us 2 of the men who had explored the land, Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, tore their clothing. They went all like Hulk Hogan on it. Rah! They were very upset. And they said to all the people of Israel, the land we traveled through and explored is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, which is really what they're saying, and if the Lord is pleased with us, obviously he is pleased with us, right? If the Lord is pleased with us, which he is, he will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It is a rich land flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. Whew, man, that's so punchy. God's got this. Look, they are not a problem for God. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. These dudes, I mean, they had faith for the fight. They had faith for the fight. I don't think they were naive, Johnny. I think they knew that there was a fight. These were formidable foes. The giants, the descendants of Anak lived in the hill country. They not only were huge, they had the high ground, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We're not meant to assess, oh, well, everyone else thinks this or does this. Listen, God is big enough. Another takeaway, never choose familiarity and comfort with your wilderness over faith and passion for your promised land.
There it is.
That is it. You're right, Ben. That's the big takeaway for today. That's the one that'll land in your notes. Never choose familiarity and comfort with your wilderness over faith and passion for your promised land. Don't try to go back to Egypt. And incidentally, Numbers 13, I'm getting close here. Numbers 13, 4 through 15. Actually gave a list of all 12 of those scouts. And here are their names. The first one was Shemua, which was almost like Shemu, but Shemua, Shaphat, Palti, Gaddiel, Gadi, Amiel, Sethur, Nabi. I actually did research on how to pronounce these. I'm not sure how close I'm getting, but I worked on it. Gul. I love you guys. I hope you know that. Igel. That's 10. Anybody ever known anyone named after any of them folk? Because I haven't.
No.
And then there were Joshua and Caleb. And then God, he said, I'm done with these people. I'm done with them. And Moses is amazing in this story because they wanted to stone Moses, and he advocates for God to relent on just destroying them all right there on the spot. You know, and then God says, okay. And in verse 28 of chapter 14, God says this, okay, all right, I'm not going to torture them right now, but tell them, as I live, declares the Lord, here's what I'm going to do. Your bodies are going to litter the wilderness. Every one of you 20 years and older who was counted in the census, the whole generation of grumblers and grousers. If anybody ever decided to pass on the census, I can now support you in that. Because I'm sure you weren't able to pass on the census then. I'm sure they counted everybody. But everyone who was counted in the census, all the grumblers and grousers, not one of you will enter the land and make your home there, the firmly and solemnly promised land, except for Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun. Your children, the very ones that you said would be taken for plunder, I'll bring them in to enjoy the land. Praise God for that. How about our faithful God? I'll bring them in to enjoy the land you rejected. 40 days of scouting and doubting turned into 40 years of dying for the doubters. 40 days of scouting and doubting turned into 40 years of dying for the doubters and wondering for their descendants. I don't want that. I don't want that for my descendants. So much of this message, where it hits my heart, so much of what we're trying to do and accomplish even as a church and a church family is for I'm 55. I know that's not old, but I can see it. I can see it from here. And you matter. You matter to God and you matter to me. Understand this. I know a lot of us, what this story describes has been our journey. Someone else made a choice that messed us up. But consider this. Sometimes the journey to all God wills for you is delayed by the choices of others, but never forever. Hear me. Never forever. Forever is your choice. It's not delayed forever. All right? If you choose to follow God, and for 40 years, it's technically 38, God gave them 2 years credit. So the total was 40, but they had 2 behind them. And in that 40 years, they had 42 campsites. And they came back through Kadesh Barnea several times, but they just couldn't go over. They went back to Sinai. They went to Horeb. They traveled all around. They went all the way back to the Red Sea. They just didn't cross. They had to wander in this wilderness till everybody died off. You guys that know me well know that I always joke at this point in the story, man, if somebody got sick and they had been over 20 in the census, I'd be like, sorry, man, good luck. No prescriptions, no medical aid. We're just going to have to let you go. 42 campsites or stopovers, manna and quail the entire time. And in that, I'll say this, it's easy to develop a sense of spiritual entitlement. Sometimes we do that too. Some of us have come out of wilderness and now we expect everybody else to feed us. At some point, you got to go get it. All right? I'm going to be here on Sundays and I'm going to preach my face off and my heart out. I don't do that. But what you do with your life, that's going to be between you and God and up to you, candidly. I mean, again, we're in this together, give you all the support we can. What do you do when no one's there? Or when the people who are around you don't feel the way the people that hold you accountable do? How's that living? What's that look like? Because that's up to you. And they had developed this sense of spiritual entitlement. God owes me mentality will always leave you wandering in the wilderness looking for a handout. But that's not where they landed, Miss Mary. It's amazing. Like, they stayed hopeful. This next generation, I mean, they saw some stuff, right? They understood the accountability. And they didn't settle at stopovers. Sometimes we do that. Like, God makes a miraculous provision for us, like our hearts were broken and we needed a certain sort of assistance or help. But don't stop there, right? Don't stay there. I grew up in a home where when I was a kid, my mom and dad struggled and they used some of the welfare assistance that was there and that was available, and I was thankful for that. And the day I graduated I graduated from high school on a Friday night, and my mom graduated from college on a Saturday morning. She just didn't stay there. Do you hear what I'm trying to say? I mean, just come on. Yeah, use the help you need when you need it, but it's a stopover. Don't stay there. Keep living, keep learning, keep walking toward the will of God for you. And then finally, come on out, worship team, after 40 years, all the detractors die off and they're back at Kadesh Barnea. The story we started with. Numbers 13:1. But now we're in Joshua 1-3. They're back. They finally made it all the way back. They got back. And they're there. And they know, I'm sure they kept up. Everybody's gone. And all the signs have been fulfilled. Moses had died, and Joshua leads a faith-filled people across the Jordan into the promised land. And no scouts were sent. They didn't send any scouts. They got a word from God. The angel of the Lord showed up, and he was like a mighty warrior, and Joshua saw him and said, whose side are you on? Ours are our enemies. And he said, neither. I'm the angel of the host of the Lord's army. Whose side are you on? Joshua said, yours. He said, all right, get the priests out front and tell them to walk into the water. What? Yeah, just tell them to walk into the water. And as soon as their feet hit, come on, the Jordan was at flood stage. He didn't even make it low. He didn't have to. He didn't make it easy. He didn't have to. As soon as their feet hit the water, backed all the way up to a place called Adam. I mean, God made it real dry. Like they couldn't even see the water. It just stopped. It just stopped. And they walked into, come on somebody, the promised land. And then Caleb, finish with this. Joshua 14:11 said this. Today I'm 85 years old. So now, let me give you this quick bit of backstory. So now we're all the way forward here. And they have essentially conquered most of the area they're meant to inhabit and handed it off. There's this one place that's left unconquered. It's the hill country. It's where the giants are. Saved it for last. And back when Joshua was so brave and courageous, Moses said, you get to hill country. You get to come back, and when you come back, that's going to be for you. And your descendants. The place where people are really free. Where they can really see and know. You get the hill country. So here's Caleb. Now 40 years later. Today, he said, I'm 85 years old. And I'm as strong as I was when Moses sent me on the journey. And I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised to me. You will remember that as scouts, we found the descendants of Anak living there in great walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, and it is, but if the Lord is with me, which obviously he is, I will drive them out of the land. Just as the Lord. After all these years, and Joshua and Caleb still remembered. They remembered their past, their history with him, not their past of hurt and brokenness. They remembered their history with him. They remembered his presence. They remembered his power. And they never forgot his promise. And they walked in.